Hey everyone, welcome back. HaloTheorist here, coming at you guys with my 11th podcast, and today we're going to be talking about the Flood. Today I'm joined by my good online gaming buddy Hydra, if you'd like to say hi.
Hi everyone.
So today Hydra and I are going to cover pretty much one of the most intimidating and most fascinating enemies that we face throughout the Halo universe, the Flood, and we're going to go into kind of some of their history, their development, where they're currently at in the universe, and then maybe even where they're going to be in the future for games like Halo Infinite. So I'm going to kind of start off with doing a little bit of a history with the Flood. The Flood is a fictional parasitic alien life form from Halo, and it was introduced in the first game, Halo CE Combat Evolved, on the level 343 Guilty Spark. And in this facility, which was a containment facility on the Halo Ring Installation 04, which is the ring that you play on during almost all of the events, short of the first level in Halo Combat Evolved, they were actually put in there to be studied after the events that had happened hundreds of thousands of years prior. To sort of kind of go into those events, very, very early on, back way before even the Halo array was fired, the Flood was introduced to the Halo universe and is clearly an infection in a parasitic life form. In fact, there's a Latin phrase for it that the Forerunners gave to it, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce it, but in short, the meaning of it was called the dead reincarnated, and that's exactly pretty much what it is. The Flood is a parasitic organism that reproduces and grows by consuming sentient life forms of sufficient biomass and cognitive capability. Now, that's kind of a lot of big words for anyone who's there and sees that, but pretty much what it means is that you have to have enough meat on your bones and enough thoughts going on in your brain for the Flood to want to consume you appropriately. And oddly enough, with the Halo array, this same targeting system with sufficient biomass and cognitive capability was how the Halo array managed to wipe out the entire universe selectively for the Flood, i.e. being the reason why the Flood need their food. Now, the Flood was responsible for consuming most of sentient life forms in the galaxy prior to the Halo array, including a vast majority of the Forerunners during the Forerunner Flood War. Now, the Forerunner Flood War was something that actually took place after the Human Forerunner War. The humans were the first individuals to come into contact with the Flood, and they actually came into contact with what was known as a dust, and this dust was a regenerative dust that we've talked about before. This dust was actually the leftover remnants of the precursors, which were a race of beings who were very high in the galaxy, I believe it's the galaxy tier or space tier race that the Halo universe uses in order to categorize how far a civilization or race is in terms of how advanced they are. Now, the precursors were the highest in the Halo universe that have ever been recorded. However, they were the ones that created the mantle of responsibility and bestowed it upon the Forerunners. In turn, eventually, this was actually revoked from them, and what we end up seeing was the Forerunners being very, I guess, irritated at the event that happened, and eventually it broke out into an quote-unquote unprovoked attack against the precursors by the Forerunners. And eventually, once the Forerunners almost drove the precursors to near extinction, the precursors turned themselves into this regenerative dust that I mentioned a few moments ago. This dust was, and its purpose was to regenerate the precursors in their original form hundreds of thousands of years later. Unfortunately, something happens with this dust, and not going too deep into a lot of it, so I don't, I guess, spoil some of the Forerunner trilogy, even though we kind of are going into it. The dust doesn't come back and work properly, and as a result, we see what is known as, and what the Forerunners designate, LF.XX.3273, which is the Flood supercell that is often referred to by the Forerunners, and it serves as the basis of all Flood biomass. And that's going to include everything from the forms that we see in game to just mass that is being consumed by the Gravemind in order to be, accumulated and things like that. And so eventually what we see after that is the humans having to deal with the Flood outbreak, or at least the initial Flood outbreak. And What it was eventually, and what we learned later, is the wrath of the precursors due to their extinction by the Forerunners. And throughout the Halo universe history, we see that happen, and they actually drive humans to near extinction, with humanity being caught between a two-front war due to the fact that humanity knew the endangerment level of the flood and would glass planets and get rid of them. However, the Forerunners didn't necessarily agree with that methodology, and so there actually sparked another war, which was the Human Forerunner War. So humanity, now fighting on two fronts, ends up getting caught in a pinch and almost is it's entirely eradicated with the anger and aggressive of the didact and things like that, kind of what we see in Halo 4. But it ends with humanity actually giving up a third of their race and their population in order to provide the flood and for them to stop their advancement, to end up engulfing them entirely. As we later see, the didact runs into the flood, and that begins what I mentioned a few moments ago as well, was the Forerunner Flood War in the ancient past prior to the firing of the Halo array. Now, the Forerunners knew that the flood would return because they had actually not interacted, but they had actually known of them during the Human Forerunner War. And so prior to this, we start the events that the Eculin Council begins, and that is between the Librarian, the Didact, and the Master Builder. Now, the Master Builder is someone I mentioned before, and he kind of goes into a categorization of exactly what his title is he builds many of the installations and things that we see with the remnants of the Forerunners. Now, the initial plan for the flood wasn't actually to use the Halo array, it was to use shield worlds, which are things that we see in things like Halo Wars, and if you read the book Ghosts of Onyx and things like that, the shield worlds were supposed to be used as outposts. And these outposts would help detect the ability to know that a flood was in an area, and the forces that would be around the outpost would recede inside of it, similar to how we see in Halo 4, and be protected from the flood. Well, eventually things like this didn't work out very well, and with the flood continuously engaging, and eventually the turn of Medicant Bias, who was a contender class Forerunner AI built by the Didact, whose job was the defense against the flood and for all of pretty much Forerunners, was turned by the Primordial. The Primordial was a being that was captured by humanity initially before the end of the Human Forerunner War, but with the defeat of humanity, Forerunners obtained this being, and this being is quite odd. And from here, I'm actually going to kind of pass it over to Hydra. Hydra knows, and I have both read the initial Forerunner trilogy and know a lot of the events that occur, but there's kind of a lot of speculation to what exactly the Primordial is, and whether or not it is the Grave Mind or it's the last of the precursors, or what exactly it is. So Hydra, if you would like to kind of go on and tell me what your thoughts on are about that, or any information that you know.
Well, personally, I believe the primordial, quote unquote, is a more evolved version of a grave mind, as by the time ancient humans had got hold of it, it had been around for hundreds of thousands of years. So, but in that time, it would have collected so much biomass and learnt so much, it would have become into what's essentially a key mind, which is basically a planet grave mind, but more evolved. So it's able and smaller. Um, but in that case, it's just personally like that. However, the going back to what you said about ancient humans finding the precursor dust, they they gathered it all up in ships, automated ships, um, and they what am I saying? They sent it towards the bounds, the margins of the galaxy, Milky Way galaxy, the large megalic cloud. This was this is where the dust slowly deteriorated itself along with the ships. The remains were later discovered by the other humans, by the other ancient humans who were found on the deserted worlds near the border. They then tested the powder on on dogs essentially, or Peru or San Shayum. that's what profits are. They both tested it on the dogs. They
Hmm.
it resulted in a more docile behavior. Um, but at the time, they didn't know that it was altering the genetic code of the probe, which manifested them into what is essentially the first sort of flood over several centuries. Um, they um, they had bursts of fury, and they soon grew like extra fleshy bits on them. Um, then they um, then they eventually rebelled against the humans in the Sunshine, which eventually created the first outbreak. And at that time, the powder had corrupted itself, and it was eventually moving on to humans. Towards that end, the limbs on the humans on the infected Sunshine would eventually become what was looked like on a combat form or a juggernaut, which is whips and broken bones and stuff. And they would fly to fury and just attack anyone. The infection was very quick, and the attempts to quarantine the worlds were failed. And as soon as the flood broke out, hundreds of worlds fell in within weeks. Um, then going back to what you said, the human fleets began destroying foreigner ships and worlds, and the leader of the human fleets chose not to warn the foreigners about the actions they were taking at the time to stop the flood.
Yeah, because
And
they wouldn't have agreed with it. I mean, they were pretty much destroying entire worlds in order to
mm,
get rid of the flood because they knew the damage that the flood could cause and how bad it was getting.
yeah, and and they foreigners didn't at the time think the flood was that bad. They thought it would kill itself off, and some even believed that it was a fiction of a humanity. Well, it was a made-up humanity propaganda game to make sure that it wasn't it to basically force the foreigners into war because apparently they were making expansionist art aims, so like conquer more worlds.
And we see stuff like that in Halo 4, like the cutscene on I believe it's Reclaimer, where the
Yeah.
librarian kind of goes into it and she says, you know, you guys weren't expanding, you were running from the flood.
Mm.
So, I
Um.
mean, for just kind of like providing some of the background information, I really appreciate you going and delving more deeper into the events because a lot of players don't actually know the events that occur and know why the flood are like that or anything really about the human Forerunner war and the, I guess, technicalities of what went down. And like you're saying, similar to how we have history of our wars, you're saying that, you know, some of the Forerunners believed it was, you know, even human propaganda just
Mm.
to provide reasoning for why they're expanding, why they keep going into it, and that would create tension, which eventually led to the Forerunner Flood War, which is what we see and what we learn about later in the games and whatnot. So, I mean, let's
Yeah.
kind of then jump on to the array. So, how the array, if you want to explain how that came about, because there was obviously the transition from using shield worlds and the Didax forces to and eventually the turn of Medicant bias with the primordial
Yeah.
via the logic plague, which is we've discussed that before, which I would like to go more in depth on in this podcast because the logic plague, I mean, is officially a flood term that the flood use, but that can go a little bit later, probably more like at the end when we're thinking about theories for Halo Infinite.
Yeah.
So what then do you think? I mean, if you'd like to explain, then moving on to the transition to saying that even the Forerunners now are dealing with the flood.
Yeah. Um. Towards the end of the Foreigner Flood War, the foreigners had realised that all hope was essentially lost at winning this war. So they turned to the builders, which created the Ark and the arrays. The Ark was essentially a basically warehouse where it would create these mega structures that would use to target specific areas and species. Well, as Halo said earlier about them targeting sentient life. Um,
Mm-hmm.
the um, the Ark is classed as a Dyson sphere, which is in modern terms a array that goes around a sun. But it's classed as a Dyson sphere because it's much larger than 93,000 miles. And the ring worlds, which is the arrays, are only 6,000 miles wide.
So
Um,
we're talking like more than 10 times the size of even one Halo installation.
yes,
Okay.
yes, we are. Because the Ark is essentially the bastion of basically it contained everything. It had flowing ecosystems from every galaxy, every planet in the galaxy. And that's where the librarian kept most of her subjects before they were dished out to the rest of the arrays for
Oh, so when she
repopulation.
was doing like her indexing with the life workers. And so again, just to kind of bring it all back around, the librarian was one of the three members of the Eculent Council. The Eculent Council were the individuals who pretty much decided what the entire Forerunner race would do in the actions that they would take in times of like war and development and things like that. And so just like the Didact has his warrior servants and the Prometheans and things like that, the librarian has her life workers, and the master builder obviously has his builders. And so I'm really just saying this to kind of provide some good context information because
Yeah,
attempting to visualize a lot of the Forerunner trilogy when it came out was very difficult because we had no art reference or anything like that. But now that we've seen the librarian, we've seen the Didact, and we've actually even seen the master builder in the terminals of Halo 4, to be able to kind of understand what's going on there helps out a lot.
mm, yeah,
But yeah,
uh,
please continue on with that.
yeah. But the arrays, since the arc is outside the Milky Way galaxy, the arrays take hundreds of thousands of years to reach their destination. So if one is like taken out and exploded, it takes hundreds of thousands of years for a new one to take its place. Even though in Halo 3, a new one's created in like days by 343, it even though it's quick to be made, it takes forever to reach its destination. So that's why if a flood outbreak on an installation and it gets destroyed, a new one won't take its place for hundreds of thousands of years. So the flood outbreak wouldn't be contained as quickly as possible. So the flood could spread out into other systems, and then a reclaimer or a human or a an intendant of the array would have to fire it without being corrupted by the flood. Which then brings me on to the second point of the logic plague. You can take over if you want, Halo.
Oh, okay, so just kind of really quick going on to it. The procedure that you're talking about at the very end there, we actually kind of see some of that procedure in Halo CE when Spark actually takes the index from Chief. Because we know
Mm,
that only certain individuals can activate Forerunner technology, and even more so, the Halo array. So Spark would keep it for safekeeping, but like you're saying, only certain individuals could actually activate the array.
yes.
But kind of going on from there, we see the events of that happen, and something kind of in peculiar that occurs during the events of the Forerunner Flood War is the disappearance of Zeta Halo and Medicant bias on Zeta Halo with the Primordial. And I went into this in my theory video of is 343 Guilty Spark looking for Medicant bias, which is a video I posted on YouTube. And in that video, I actually talk about what happens. And what ends up happening is during the time of the Forerunner Flood War, we see Mendicant Bias take the Primordial to Zeta Halo for study. And during this time, Zeta Halo, along with Mendicant Bias and the Primordial, disappear for 40 years. Upon their return, they come back, and Mendicant Bias is in a totally new mindset and is infected by what becomes known as the Logic Plague. And we've seen things about this, and it is actually known to the Covenant, or at least some of the San Shayum in the Covenant, due to a legendary loot crate that came out, I believe, back in 2018,
Yes.
where there was a quick data drop that showed an interrogation of a San Shayum, where he explains to the interrogator that the kind of fall of the Forerunners, and this actually is something that we see integrated into Covenant religion, where throughout most of the Halo universe, Covenant forces do not use AI because they believe it was the fall of the Forerunners, which it pretty much was with the turn of Medican bias towards the Flood, and with
Mm,
due to the logic plague, because the logic plague is something that the Flood uses with AI to sort of convince them that what they are doing and what the Flood are is correct. That I'm not necessarily sure because it kind of during the books and whatnot, they don't really explain it, but however it happens, and with what little details we do know, with prolonged periods of time when AI are exposed to flood, eventually they succumb to their will. And that's what ends up happening. And another time we see this is kind of during the events of the Halo 3 terminals. If you ever open up any of the Halo 3 terminals, you'll see a lot of references to people who D and L and things like that. And those are actually the librarian and the didact and other accounts during the Forerunner Flood War talking about things like mendicant bias turning and stuff happening where eventually in the end, like similar to I mentioned in that video with Spark looking for mendicant bias, we find out that mendicant bias is actually, or at least a part of him is actually on the Ark, and that it is quite possible that the Forerunner Dreadnought that we see in Halo 2 and in Halo 3 was holding another piece of mendicant bias. And finally, that he might be reaccumulating his pieces with the kind of the evidence I provide in that video, which I recommend you guys watch. I mean, obviously, it is not necessarily a shameless plug, but it provides a lot of background contextual information to the podcast and really kind of helps fill in a lot of the gaps and answers a lot of the questions for why these terminals were so weird in Halo 3. Well,
yeah.
I'll actually pass it off to you then. So, Medican bias turns, and now the Forerunners are pretty much losing. I
Yeah.
mean, the Medican bias is destroying them. He's a contender class AI, and the Flood is consuming them. What ends up happening now as we lead to kind of the final years leading up to the firing of the array?
Well, going back to what you said about Zeta Halo, it was a installation that was part of the Omega Halo array, which was part of the Greater Arc, which is mentioned in Halo Silentium and Halo Krypton. It was
Okay,
part.
so just for really quick, what is the greater arc? And I know that there is a lesser arc as well. So
Yeah,
what exactly are those two?
the Lesser Arc is the one that you play on in Halo 3. The Greater
Okay,
Arc was destroyed in the Flood attack.
alrighty.
And Installation '07, and we don't know the next one, is one of the only two surviving rings from the older Omega Halo array.
And that
Um,
array originally included how many Halo rings? Because we only
uh,
know of the 7 that are in the games.
there was 12 in the Omega Halo array.
And throughout the time, as we know, they were lost and either succumbed to flood attacks or other reasons they weren't finished.
hmm Um,
Alrighty, so yeah, please continue.
well, it it acts as going back to several things. It acts as a prison and a test bed for the primordial. It was originally meant for testing, which Mendicant Bias was meant to interrogate it and find out what it is about, and it went to hell effectively. and then after the Halo 3, humans, Oni managed to get onto Installation '07. Um, and it ended up being a battle uh, where the Flood, these Oni researchers ended up fighting for their lives against hordes of Flood on this Halo array. Um, and they activate the failsafe protocol, which Mendicant Bias, who is still on the array, can't override, and it acts as a self-destruct. Um, the human, the humans ended up being transported out by this. It was they don't know who it was, but I have a suspicion that it's what's left of the librarian still going around, um, and was transported back. But they later discovered that the master builder Faber used it as a testing ground for um, for the flood and on humans, which the Didact later used the proof of from the master builder for his I forget what they're called, what he used in Halo 3, Halo 4.
I'm trying to think again here. The what he used in Halo 4, the Master Builder used for what exactly?
Do you know how he made the I forget what they're called, knights? The Didact
Oh, the
made the knight.
Promethean Knights.
Yes. The master builder created that by experimenting on human and flood. And then after he was discovered by that, the Didact later took the information that was found from this and created that machine.
Oh, okay. So yeah, so then we see things like that, and finally, even 100,000 years later in Halo 4, where the
Mm.
knights are still prevalent, we see remnants even in Halo 5 of like the builders, and we actually see in Halo 5 Exuberant Witness as well, who says that she serves the builders, which I find funny because on Genesis that was actually a builder world.
Mm.
And so we kind of see remnants of those guys throughout the entire Halo universe. And funny enough, even with the activation of the Halo array, because finally Mendicant Bias does break through what I believe is called the Mango line or the Maggot line, which
Yeah.
is a real universe, but thing where the Forerunners had set up their defenses. Obviously, Forerunners don't really exist, but it is a real thing. They break through it, and eventually time runs out to where the activation of the Halo array becomes all but 100% necessary, and the librarian needs to finish indexing all species throughout the universe, and we then actually see the activation of the Halo array with pretty much the only surviving people that we know, or at least are 100% confirmed, being the Didact, because we
Mm.
have the essence of the librarian, and we obviously we have the essence of Chakas or Chakas, which is an ancient human who actually it becomes Guilty Spark, who is actually still alive. Again, this is all referenced in that video I keep mentioning. Still alive and still well, even after the events of Halo 4. So unfortunately, for in the sense of Forerunners, the only person that we knew that was still there was the Didact, but he met his end through the Halo Escalation comics as well. I don't believe it was issue like 15, 16, and 17,
Mm.
where Chief and Blue Team encounter him and whatnot. And so we know that he meets his end there, and I won't spoil that for you if you guys want to go into those, because those are some great reads, the Dark Horse comics of that. Though that section I believe is really, really great. Dialing back now, the Halo array has been fired. Life has started over, and we're kind of at the point that we see in Halo Legends with Origins 1 and Origins 2, where Origin 1's kind of explains up into the point that we're at now, and then Origins 2 beginning with humanity and whatnot. And until then, we don't encounter the Flood again until Halo CE, which is where I mentioned, at least when in our, real world we saw the Flood for the first time,
Mm.
kind of coming out of the big history lesson and stuff that's probably just as boring as the books that we've read through. Um, what do you think then of the Flood? I mean, throughout Halo 1, 2, and 3. I mean, you even showed me in Halo 2 that there are instances where the Flood are there, and the Flood are so prevalent through at least the original trilogy
Mm.
that they're kind of woven in both into the books as well as the games, whether the player notices them or not. And so during their events through Halo 1, 2, and 3, I mean, we see the rise of the Gravemind, who clearly manifested himself via some, I guess, via some method from Installation 05 or Delta Halo. Now,
Well,
do you? Yep, sorry.
going as a grave mine managed to like form itself on installation '05. It's because the AI that was looking after it failed to quell it because he had been infected by the logic plague. And
And
he
so
just like
again, yeah, we see another instance of the logic plague.
yeah, but he didn't. He failed to enact on protocol, which is to shut down the section, which he initially did, but then didn't act on it. So that's why there's the barrier around. That's why that's at their level on Halo 2.
Oh,
I
so
feel
like the level, the sacred icon and quarantine zone, why that
yeah,
barrier blocking the library is up when we finally get to it?
yes,
Okay, so that makes sense. The library wasn't just initially defended like how we kind of see in Halo 3 when we're on the Lesser Arc. It's actually something that's been like that for probably hundreds of thousands of years.
mm,
Okay.
yeah.
So during those events, then, like in Halo 2, I mean, is there anything else? Because I mean, Halo 1, we're introduced to the Flood and we understand the concepts and whatnot.
Hmm.
And with the book First Strike, in fact, one of the only pieces of Halo lore that's had to have been changed by 343 was how Johnson escaped the containment facility from
Hmm.
Installation 04. And in the original version, when you read the book First Strike, we see Johnson, who was infected by a very weak form similar to Jenkins, which Jenkins is a Marine that, if you pay attention when you're watching the cutscene in the middle of 343 Guilty Spark, it's the name on the back of the Marine helmet. Now, Jenkins has his own story of what goes on, where he's infected by a very weak flood form and is actually captured and kind of detained by the Marines that also land with you in Halo Combat Evolved. And I believe pretty much the ranking officer of the ODSTs wants to take him and actually grab the ship that we see on the level Keys in Halo CE. He would like to take it, repair it, and bring Jenkins back along with all of the people on that Covenant ship to Earth. Now, again, this is just for contextual information. Unfortunately, I'm going to have this kind of spoil First Strike. Jenkins, as well as some of the science officers and many other people that are there, understand, similar to how ancient humanity understood, that the Flood are too great to leave, like that, to bring back to Earth. That's not where you want to have the Flood, like how we eventually see in Halo 3. And so they choose to instead destroy the ship, which is why the reactors had already gone off when we finally get there in Halo CE, with Chief and Keys and the Proto Gravemind already being on there, because that event had already occurred. Now, Johnson, similar to how Jenkins had part of his consciousness still there due to a very, very weak infection form, also was infected by a flood. And we can actually see that in that cutscene. But Johnson actually has a little kind of a peculiar thing going on with him. For those of you who don't know, Johnson is part of the Orion 1 project, which is also known as the Spartan 1 project, because the Spartan 2s are Orion 2s. And Sergeant Johnson, throughout the games, the reason why he's so prevalent, other than the fact that he's an extremely likable character, was a Spartan 1 and actually has had neurological and other changes done to him and augmentations, not as severe as the Spartan 2s, but in progressive step towards that. Dr. Halsey had obviously a project before the full-on Spartan 2 project. Now, because the neural workings of Sergeant Johnson and his nerves were so different than what the Flood were used to, they didn't think that they could make anything from it. And with so few forms available to be, to infect and to start an outbreak, they chose not to actually infect Johnson and actually left him alone. Now, 343, and with everything we know now with the release of the books and whatnot, like the Forerunner trilogy, we know now that Johnson did not do that. 343 seems very adamant on there being no cure to the Flood. While the Forerunners believe that humanity might have found a cure at one point, there's no real piece of evidence throughout any piece of Halo media other than what this First Strike book originally presented that now has been changed. And it was changed so that Johnson, just fought his way out of the facility. Unfortunately, because there's kind of that discrepancy going on now, it's kind of confusing, but it is something that's similar to kind of, if you've ever seen Star Wars, where now that Disney has taken over, there's Legends as well as which was the old canon, and now the new canon. It's similar to like that. You just kind of need to interpret it differently. So we meet them with Installation 04. We see them, and like you're saying, with the events in Installation 05 in Delta Halo. Let's finish up with, the last time we saw them as Chief, which was in Halo 3, both on Earth and the Ark, if you want
Hmm.
to go on from there.
Well, the flood on Earth was killed. Well, the infection was stopped by the Sanghili fleet glassing what was left of Africa at the time after we evacuated to the Ark. The flood on the Ark, although we thought were destroyed by the firing of Installation 08, which was the replacement for 04, um, and then later on in Halo Wars 2, 09, but wasn't killed because they somehow survived in High Charity, which you then fight in Halo Wars 2.
And
Um,
that kind of brings us to our last point now, which is kind of looking towards the future. We know that the flood in the Halo universe still exists. So what do you think now? I mean, kind of just in the free reign. Do you think the flood will be and present in the future?
Most definitely. I think they will have a huge role to play in Halo Infinite because it's basically bringing it all back. But I I do believe they will hold some significance in the future of the Halo universe. Yes.
Okay. What about like the grave mind? I mean, obviously, we believe that the grave mind was destroyed, or at least was killed with the destruction of Installation 04B, or as you referenced it, Installation 08, with the Ark. But clearly, some floods survived. Do you think we'll see a return of a grave mind like that again? Do you think it'll be as
Well,
prevalent, or maybe even how will Cortana feel like she needs to deal with it if she is infected by the logic plague or not? Because I presented a video that's totally against that.
hmm. Well, personally, in Halo Wars 2, we see the addition of pure strains, which is like the Juggernaut or the flying ones or the spores. They can only be created when there's a grave mind. So I believe there's a grave mind still in High Charity, and
Okay,
I
so
do.
you believe he's still in there because, like you're saying, they're pure strains. They could only be made from that original being.
Yeah.
So that's something heavy to take in. That now looking towards the future, that could be there.
Hmm. Well, as well, because if there is still the grave mind in there, either faction, the AI faction or the human faction, whichever wins, is still going to have to deal with the flood, which is on every single Forerunner installation across the galaxy in storage, and they need to find a
Hmm.
way to get rid of them. Because unless they don't get rid of it, it's just going to keep breaking out and doing its thing.
Well, the flood, as we know, needs sufficient biomass and something to consume in order to thrive and take over. And you mentioned both the AI faction and the human faction, but I feel like we left out maybe one of the most important ones, which are the Banished, because the Banished were the ones that found the flood in High Charity. Do you think
Yeah.
that the flood will be able to, I guess, obtain and grow more forces through the Banished?
Well, most definitely, because they're a splinter faction of the Covenant, aren't they?
Yeah, they are a splinter faction, but they seem to be, at least a severe splinter faction. Again, as I made another video talking about the Banished and their return, and the fact that they kind of present an old Covenant art style, and how the old Covenant operate. I mean, short of there being prophets, in fact, now it's just Atriox.
Hmm.
But they're the ones that currently are dealing with it. I mean, for what we know, humanity doesn't even know that there's flood on the Lesser Ark still. So could that be something that kind of hits either humanity or even Cortana, like on the from the blind side?
Well, yeah, it could, because it could come as an utter shock to see both Covenant, the Spirit of Fire faction, and the Flood battle it out on the Lesser Ark. Because as if I don't know if you recall, but as a legendary ending for Halo Wars 2, the installation '09, which is a replacement for '04. Well, was two replacements, but '09 is the complete one in Halo Wars 2.
Hmm.
It was teleport. It was slip spaced, and the Guardian pulled it out of slip space. So that could be another like show into what could happen because the
That they
Guardians
could
can
be
crack
on that.
slip space.
Yeah, because they could be on that ring and possibly just waiting and dormant for an opportunity to strike, similar to High Charity, is what you're saying?
Yes, because the Guardian pulled it out, so it has to be a reason why they pulled it out of slip space.
No, that definitely makes sense. That then the reasoning for them being stopped wasn't due to anything that Anders had done, but rather that Cortana now knows that the flood are
Hmm.
prevalent again and can
Yes.
actually cause issues. So that is something that I feel like is very very important to take into account when you're looking at possibly the future game Halo Infinite and what's coming out. So then what do you then think about the ring that we see in the Discover Hope trailer? I mean, many people have said that speculated that they think it's Zeta Halo. If it
Well,
was, what would that mean? Or what do you think then?
personally, Zeta Halo had already been discovered by Oni agents, but I it, it has damage to it, which matches up with the damage which was caused by the attack by the flood. So it could be Installation 07, but it's just it's just matching up how the UNSC forces managed to get to Installation 07
What would cause them
to
to
fight the
not know
AI
where
or
it's
what?
at or to get
Yeah,
there?
yeah, because the AI, the only agents were only there by sheer accident.
Okay, so even the navigational data leading there would be something like that, which would also kind of present a new angle to look at the Discover Hope trailer because many people believe that that break in the ring or that destruction was caused by a battle that the Pelican pilot references.
Mm,
But if it wasn't, if the battle wasn't caused by that and was rather caused by the events that you're saying, where the Oni agents had to fight for their life on Zeta Halo,
mm,
that would then mean that the flood being introduced is all but sure that they're clearly there. The Cortana is clearly dealing with them,
mm.
and that's what's going on. So then, do you believe that Cortana maybe is infected by the logic plague? Because from what we're discussing, at least in theory, her actions would be to are all in opposition to the flood outbreaks rather
Well,
than kind of in accordance. Or do you see it from a different angle?
Medical bias, before he was discovered to have the logic plague, he acted with the Forerunners to look like he was aiding against the flood when in reality he was aiding them.
So it could be a similar thing to like you're saying. It could be
Mm.
her acting with it. Do you think that then maybe the logic plague could play a role in something to Cortana and maybe even the actions that she took in Halo 5? I mean, Halo 5 is kind of all over the place for so many people, but then would it kind of explain, what then would be the dynamic between Cortana and Chief? Why would it be so weird, I guess, where she wants to clearly do this action, which is use the Guardians to take over the galaxy and, enforce it with them, yet seeks approval from John or Master Chief? Do you think that would still work?
Mm. Well, Cortana's action in Halo 5 was very drastic because she straight up kidnapped Blue Team, didn't she?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, by all means, Blue Team went to her, but yet she still clearly planned to imprison them for 10,000 years.
Hmm. Because I believe she has the logic plate personally. Because
Mm-hmm.
which smart AI, even if it is Ravency, but which I believe wasn't the case, because she split herself up at the end of Halo 4.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard to explain. It's because she's acting out of pure simulated emotions at the moment. And it's just that all her actions are dictated by how she feels.
I
And
can see that. That makes
it,
sense.
mm, it's just, it looks like this instance of the logic plague, but at the same time, it doesn't.
And that's why I find it so funny. I mean, many people, including YouTubers like Hidden Xperia, I believe Installation 00, and a lot of these people clearly believe it. And honestly, I myself believe that there's a significant chance that she does. But I wanted to look at what I made the video, if Cortana has the logic plague, why she might not. Because I wanted to look at it from the other side of the argument. I wanted to give it a fair chance because, like you're saying, Halo 5, every time I played it, just didn't feel or seem like Cortana was doing anything that was in accordance to it. I mean, she sought the approval of Chief. She sought, to uphold the mantle of responsibility
Mm,
and, follow through with the events that were made all the way back in the development days of Halo Combat Evolved, where if you guys don't know and haven't seen that video that I made, the original plan for Cortana when Chief reconciles with her on the level 2 betrayals after meeting Guilty Spark and obtaining the index was that Cortana had been riddled with power and was going to use the Installation 04, the Halo, to kind of hold the universe at gunpoint. And now we actually see this again in the Halo 5. So for me, it just screamed to me the whole game like this is what's happening. This is
mm,
a different writing of what happened there and could possibly mean that these events didn't there's no logic plague here, especially if Cortana is supposed to have some sort of redemption arc. Because, I mean, as we all know, at least I, as a Halo fan, would really like to see Cortana come back, kind of in Star Wars reference to the good side, to the light side, and come out of this. But in order to do that, the speculation that YouTubers and the Halo community have been doing is trying to decipher what exactly is wrong with Cortana. And in that
Hmm.
arose the Halo, the logic plague. In that arose, kind of what I presented with the different story rewrite, as well as the multiple instances of Halo 5 being rewritten by different story writers.
Hmm.
So, kind of trying to pinpoint it as one thing, unfairly as it was for me to kind of ask you, is really hard to do because we
Yeah.
won't we won't know until Halo Infinite. At least that's what I mean. Obviously, I believe until the game comes out, but
Hmm.
even in the pieces of Halo media that have come out since then, like the books, there's really no new information that really kind of spits out other than that legendary loot crate data drop.
Yeah.
And you know, as it being a legendary loot crate data drop, I can appreciate its lore and canon value, but one of the things that makes Halo really good is that anyone can understand what's going on by picking up any of the games. And Halo 5 kind of didn't do that. Halo 4 really struggled to, and Halo 1, 2, and 3 were kind of the first three games that were made, and so the explanations weren't nearly as long as the later games would have to be, especially by a different company.
Hmm.
So, would it be a good idea to kind of use that as like a structural foundation to say, yeah, this is for sure saying that Cortana has the logic plague?
Well, you can sort of see her descent into, because in Halo 1 she's more like by the book. By Halo 2
Mm-hmm.
she's more like flexible and stuff. By Halo 3 she doesn't care. And she has been with the Flood a long time by Halo 3.
Mm-hmm.
And, and she was still getting into early stage rampancy by then. So I think she was more open to like the logic plague than any AI could be at that time. And
Okay.
that would lead her to being infected by the logic plague. But it's just the evidence there, but I don't personally want it to act on it. But at the same time, I do.
Well, and just kind of in my head, as a like, in line with my MO and like my theories that I make, a way I can see out of that is that we know Cortana is different than many AI. Cortana
Well,
was made,
she's
yeah,
effectively a scan of Halsey's brain.
yeah, like a clone rather
Hmm.
than something like that. So, as we see in Infinite, there could, I mean, maybe there could be a way to recompile Cortana in a correct sense, because in Halo 4, that line that I reference all the time is that Cortana says that, it could be possible to recompile I forget what she says, like my neural net or my framework by getting back to Halsey. And, but we need to do it soon, or, and we need to get back there fast. So
Hmm.
this is, what that kind of thought sparked the theories that I've always bring up, where it's like, what if the second ship that we have is just another Cortana, and that the secret audio log the dialogue that we hear from the Discover Hope trailer that can be found through the QR code from the flashes on the Chief's boot up screen is
Hmm.
actually another Cortana, saying that she's like saying this is part of me. She's like, I don't know why or how, but it's me. And what that actually is rather than Cortana, finding a piece of, let's say, like a fragment of herself that was split off during her time at the end of Halo 4, it's actually a new Cortana. It would also explain the reason why the uh, AI chip that Chief holds is one serial number after Cortana's serial number,
Hmm.
and is actually just like a redemption, of how Cortana's going to come back together and fight off the logic plague.
Yeah. But either way, I'm gonna be looking forward to Halo Infinite because if the Flood appear in it, it's gonna be interesting to watch a three-way battle against humanity. Because the
Oh, and I
Covenant's
definitely agree.
rumored to be in there, and it's gonna be the AI faction. If the Flood's there, it's gonna be a hellhole.
Yeah, so we're looking at a possibility of the Banished, humanity, the AI, and the Flood. That's four factions just there, That's
Mm.
not even counting, possibly some of the resistance or the I forget the insurrectionist and stuff as
Yeah.
well, which have become prevalent through the novels recently with books like Bad Blood and whatnot.
Mm.
So I think that's great, and we're kind of approaching up on an hour here, so I think that we'll wrap it up. Was there anything else that you wanted to say before the end of the podcast?
Well, no, not really. It's been very fun though.
Yeah, it's been awesome and amazing talking to you, man. I really hope to have you here in the future. I know that as we come up to Infinite and as my road to Infinite keeps going on, I'm sure that there will be many a time where I can have you back on, dude, and we can talk and kind of explore more into it because you're one of the most developed people I know with the Halo universe, and the amount of information you know and the knowledge that you possess is extremely valuable. And being able to talk with you like this presents a whole new side that I extremely enjoy about the Halo universe and why I do the YouTube channel and everything. So thank you so much for coming on for this one. I sincerely appreciate it.
No worries, man.
All right. Well, thank you guys very much. Remember, I'm going to be posting my podcast again now every Wednesday up until the release of Halo Infinite. And after that, we'll probably start talking about Halo Infinite and maybe even the future of what goes on. So please remember to come in at every Wednesday. It's going to be at 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. I'm also doing my game nights every Friday from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And I'm streaming 5 days a week on Twitch. So make sure you guys check those out. And I will see you guys next time.